Good
I'm,
morning.
Good morning. I'm Cindy Williams, President of CalWork Safety and HR. Thank you for attending our webinar this morning. Our webinar this morning is about the importance of active shooter training and Cal OSHA'S indoor heat illness standard. Before we get started, I'd like for you to let us know what you would be interested in learning about during future webinars, as it's very important to us to ensure that we're discussing topics that are important to you and your company. So if you'd be kind enough to place that information in the chat, that would be great. And we'll collect that information at the end of the webinar and take a look at that and use common themes, and we'll bring that information to you in the future. With that said, I'd like to introduce to you Kayla Washington. Kayla is an accomplished labor law attorney. Not only is Kayla a partner and owner of Employer Legal and HR Solutions, she also works for us as an HR and safety professional. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Kayla. Welcome, Kayla.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Okay, so like Cindy mentioned, we're going to be discussing the importance of active shooter training and Cal OSHA'S indoor heat illness standard. So just a quick legal disclaimer before we get started. The information in this presentation is intended for informational and informal purposes only and shouldn't be considered legal advice. So you're strongly encouraged to consult your own legal counsel to ensure compliance with applicable law in your specific state, municipality, or jurisdiction. So to start off, we're going to discuss the active shooter training. So employers are encouraged to implement active shooter training, especially after conducting workplace violence prevention training. I know that was a big push with us the past few months as we were getting all the plans sent out, all the training sent out. So now it's a good opportunity to look at some trainings that build on top of that, such as active shooter. So it helps to reduce the risk of injury or fatality by really adequately preparing employees for an active shooter situation. So in conjunction with active shooter training, you're going to want to make sure that you have an up-to-date emergency action plan for your company. So this plan's really imperative because it lists out evacuation responses, proper emergency escapes and procedures. It should have your evacuation maps on there as well, and emergency contact information. So we're going to want to make sure that that's all up to date because that plays into the workplace violence prevention training as well as this active shooter training. So what's considered an active shooter event? So according to the Department of Homeland Security, an active shooter event is when an individual is actively engaged in killing or attempting to kill people in a confined and populated area. So even when called, law enforcement may not be able to respond as quickly to the scene, which makes it very important that individuals, especially your employees in the workplace, know how to handle the situation. So there are some indicators that are noted by the Department of Homeland Security because it's very unlikely that the workplace violence event is random. So there's some indicators prior to the event actually occurring. So the Department of Homeland Security has a non-exhaustive list of indicators, and a few that I chose here were an increase in use of alcohol or drugs, noticeable decline in appearance or hygiene, unstable emotional reactions, and discussions about personal problems at home. A couple others are repeated breaches of company policies, heightened and severe mood swings, and then some talks about past violent incidents.
Can you take the wheels out?
So here we have some mass shooting statistics. According to an article from BBC titled "How Many U.S. Mass Shootings Have There Been in 2023?" So we don't have the numbers for 2024 as of yet, of course, since we're still right in the middle. But as you can see here, they have increased. 2023 saw a little bit of a dip from 2022 and 2021, but still it has been an increase since 2014. So SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, has also done a few studies regarding workplace violence incidents and kind of active shooter events. And according to 48% of those in HR had said their organization had at some point experienced workplace violence. They also saw a 36% increase in those who stated violence had occurred in the workplace from 2012. So, another chart that I found interesting was, does the workforce feel prepared to respond to violence? And actually, a good number, 82% of HR professionals, did somewhat or strongly agree that they would know what to do if they witnessed a violent event or were involved in a workplace violence incident. 71% of employees somewhat or strongly agreed that they would know what to do if they witnessed or were involved in a workplace violence incident. So rather than HR professionals and employees believing that they would know what to do in a workplace violence incident, giving active shooter training would really ensure that they had the confidence and knowledge to know how to handle that particular situation. So I thought this was a helpful image from the National Sheriff's Association. This was from February of 2016. And it kind of details what happens when you call 911. I think oftentimes we think of, if there's a workplace violence incident event, an active shooter, we call 911 and they'll respond right away. But unfortunately, that isn't always the case. So I felt like this chart really depicted how a call is traced from the point that you call 911 to the time that officers actually arrive. So it does have to go to, of course, a 911 call center. You're speaking to a dispatcher. They have to direct the call to the appropriate agency, such as the police department or fire department, and then the agency will dispatch officers. So the average shooting lasts about 12 or so minutes, while the average police response time is 18 minutes. So that's why it's actually really vital that employees know how to conduct themselves in an active shooter emergency, as law enforcement are likely to get there after the emergency or event has already occurred. So, CalWorks Safety and HR offers active shooter training, which is powered by AVERT, which is the Active Violence Emergency Response Training. That's the title of the company in the program, and we use their materials. So, this interactive training really provides guidance to employees on how to control bleeding before emergency medical services arrive, discusses situational awareness, how to quickly react in an emergency situation, and strategies on how to escape, defend, and attack should it come to that point. So, some additional tips about this training: it's interactive, so the training contains videos, questions. It also uses prompts to really accurately gain skills needed to prepare for such an event. Also, with the treating an injury, employees should learn how to correctly pack a wound, applying a tourniquet. In terms of situational awareness, there'll be really warning signs of active shooters, similar to what we discussed in that previous slide. How to identify some possible threats as well, with quickly reacting to an emergency situation. It'll really think about how to react in a flight, fight, or freeze situation and how to overcome that freeze response. So that way you're able to better protect yourself and other employees should an active shooter situation occur. So we're going to go on to the next topic, which is Cal OSHA's indoor heat illness standard. So this went into effect early, actually, July 23rd. And if you need an indoor heat illness plan, you can contact your Cal Work Safety HR safety consultant, and they should be providing you with one, as we recently just got them finished. So the Cal OSHA Indoor Heat Illness Prevention Standard applies to all indoor work areas where the temperature equals or exceeds 82 degrees when employees are present. I don't know how familiar you all are with this, but this is actually something that Cal OSHA has been thinking about enacting for years now, and they are finally able to approve it and pass it through. So absent exceptions, and of course with Cal OSHA, exceptions to the exceptions, this applies to, like I mentioned, indoor work areas for the most part, which equal or exceed 82 degrees. So some of those exceptions include remote working locations, situations where there's incidental heat exposure. An exception to that exception, like I mentioned, is vehicle without effective and functioning air conditioning or shipping or intermodal containers during loading, unloading, or related work. An incidental heat exposure is considered an employee to be exposed to the 82-degree temperature or higher for less than 15 minutes in any 60-minute working period, just so you have an idea of what Cal OSHA means by incidental heat exposure. So another exception is emergency operations directly involved in the protection of life or property. Some exemptions from the indoor heat illness standard are prisons, local detention facilities, and juvenile facilities, but there are exceptions to that as well. So no matter what, an indoor work area is subject to this indoor heat illness standard, whether they meet the exemptions that I just described in the following situations, where temperatures and or heat index equals or exceeds 87 degrees when employees are present. Employees wear clothing that restricts heat removal and the temperature equals or exceeds 82 degrees Fahrenheit. And employees work in a high radiant heat area and the temperature equals or exceeds 82 degrees Fahrenheit. So what Cal OSHA means with clothing that restricts heat removal, that'll mean full body clothing that covers arms, legs, and torso that is either waterproof, designed to protect the wearer from chemical, biological, physical, radiological, or fire hazard, or is designed to protect the wearer from or the wearer or the work process from contaminants. So there's also exceptions to that as well. So if you have any questions specifically regarding the clothing that restricts heat removal, please contact your CalWork safety consultant. So in addition to the requirements that we will discuss, with the cases that are just described, an employer must also measure the temperature and heat index and record whichever is greater, identify and evaluate all environmental risk factors for heat illness, maintain accurate records of temperature or heat index measurements, and those measurements must include the date, time, and specific location of the measurements. If an employer wants to bypass the measuring portion, they can assume that their work area is subject to those higher standards of the 87 degrees and instead follow these requirements listed. So using engineering controls to reduce and maintain a temperature and heat index to be below 87 degrees, or to reduce the temperature to below 82 degrees, where employees wear clothing that restricts heat removal or work in high radiant heat areas. They can also implement administrative controls to minimize the risk of heat illness when engineering controls aren't sufficient. So some assessment and control measures are typically what we see in some other plans where an employer really want to encourage employees and union representatives to be involved in the planning, conducting, and reporting measurements of temperature or heat index, as well as identifying and evaluating environmental risk factors for heat illness. If administrative control measures and engineering control measures aren't feasible, Cal OSHA does require that you provide personal heat protective equipment to minimize the risk of heat illness in these specific cases. And I'd suggest highly documenting your efforts for engineering controls and administrative controls to really show that those aren't feasible, and in which case you had to provide the personal heat protective equipment. But to get back to just the standard indoor heat illness prevention requirements, um, Cal OSHA requires that employees have access to potable drinking water, very similar to the outdoor heat illness requirements. So it must be fresh, pure, cool, and provided free of charge. Has to be located close by and in indoor cool down areas. And if the water isn't plumbed, there must be enough to supply 1 quart per employee per hour for drinking the entire shift. So employers may begin the shift with a smaller quantity of water if they have procedures in place to really replenish the water throughout the shift and allow employees to drink 1 quart or more per hour. So access to cool down areas, there really should be at least one cool down area at all times when employees are present. It has to be located as close as practicable to the employee work area. So during a meal period, when employees are in the cool down area, the size of that area must be at least large enough to accommodate the number of employees who are remaining on site and who are taking a meal break. So it's if you're not able to have it less than 82 degrees Fahrenheit, you have to demonstrate that it's unfeasible for you to do so. If you can't demonstrate that, then the cool down area must be less than 82 degrees Fahrenheit. So, like drinking water, the employers should encourage employees to take a preventative cool down break when employees need to do so. And access to the cool down area must be allowed at all times. This is very similar to what we see, like I mentioned, with outdoor heat illness prevention as well. So, when an employee decides to take a cool down rest, the employer really should be monitoring and asking the employee if they're experiencing any heat illness symptoms. If you can't view them yourself, then of course, always ask the employee. Encourage employees to remain in the cool down area, and employers shouldn't order employees back to work unless there's signs and symptoms of heat illness have subsided, abated, and they're no longer there. So it shouldn't be no less than 5 minutes in addition to the time needed to access the cool down area. So if it's a couple minutes of a walk to get over to the cool down area, that total time would be 7 minutes if it's taking 2 minutes for them to get there. So, with first aid, an employer must provide appropriate first aid or emergency response if it finds that an employee is exhibiting signs or reports symptoms of heat illness. Some symptoms that we know of, or maybe they become incoherent, they're vomiting, they feel nauseous. So you want to encourage them to take a preventative cool down rest, or during their preventative cool down rest period, figure out if you need to provide any first aid or emergency response by either the looks of their symptoms or what they're reporting and telling you as the employer. So, with emergency response procedures, if the signs and symptoms of heat illness rise to that level, an employer should ensure that effective communication is maintained. So, either a supervisor or emergency medical services can be contacted when necessary, should respond to signs and symptoms of possible heat illness, contact emergency medical services, and, if necessary, transport employees to a place where they can be reached by an emergency responder. This is typically the case if maybe you're working in a rural area and it's difficult for EMS to get to you quickly. Sometimes it's easier if an employer tries to do the transfer by having a supervisor drive an employee to a nearby clinic or something of that nature. You also want to ensure that clear directions to the work site can be given to emergency responders, because really, when there is a heat illness situation, time is of the essence. So, if there aren't any effective engineering controls to control the effective outdoor heat on the indoor temperature, employees should be very closely observed by a supervisor during a heat wave. So, again, very similar to outdoor heat illness, if an employee who is newly assigned to a work area where the temperature heat index equals or is greater than 87 degrees Fahrenheit, work area where the temperature heat index equals or is greater than 82 degrees Fahrenheit, for employees who wear clothing that restricts heat removal, or a high radiant heat area where the temperature equals or exceeds 82 degrees Fahrenheit. Those employees should be closely observed by the employer for the first 14 days. With the indoor heat illness training, employers really have to provide effective employee training on the environmental and personal risk factors for heat illness, the procedures for complying with the standard, importance of consumption of water, and not even necessarily the importance of water and having the quart per hour listed in the training materials, but also really actively encouraging employees to drink water. I've seen that with Cal OSHA as well, that's what they look to. When they come and do their interviews, they'll ask employees if there was water and if they're highly encouraged to drink water. So the concept, importance, and methods of acclimatization, which is what I just mentioned with employees who are new to either new hires or new to areas where there's going to be high temperatures of that 87 degrees or higher, and that they really should be monitored during that time, those first 14 days. Should also have training on different types of heat illness and common signs and symptoms. This might be very standard to those who have outdoor workers who have done heat illness training in the past and do it kind of every year during this summertime season in California. However, some of your indoor employees that this might affect, they might not know the different types of heat illness or signs and symptoms. So, for instance, some of these industries that might now be affected by indoor heat illness, like manufacturing, where there's large machinery that's causing the indoor work environment to push up to and past 82 degrees, or situations such as like bakeries and kitchens, that'll be really important to thoroughly describe the common signs and symptoms of heat illness. employee reporting duties. Who do employees report to when they observe either other employees that aren't following the heat illness prevention plan, or who are showing signs of heat illness? So it's very important to designate who the employees are to call and when they should be calling emergency medical services. There's, again, Cal OSHA violations, they get very high and they get classified as serious when employers fail to teach employees when and how to contact emergency medical services, because often that time, like I mentioned, time is of the essence with this. And if employees don't report right away, the heat illness could become very severe. Also, training on procedures for responding, like I mentioned, to signs and symptoms of heat illness, emergency medical service contact procedures, and procedures on ensuring clear directions to the work site can be provided to emergency responders. Make sure your employees, if it's in more of a remote location or a little bit difficult to access with maybe basic GPS, make sure they know cross streets, different types of landmarks where they could alert emergency medical service and let them know how to get there in the quickest way possible. So in addition to what employees should be trained on, there are a few extras that supervisors should also be trained on, because at the end of the day, when Cal OSHA comes through and if they inspect your facility, if there's been an indoor heat illness, your supervisors are really going to be the ones that they look to make sure that they follow the proper protocol. So supervisors should be additionally trained on procedures when an employee exhibits signs and symptoms consistent with heat illness, and how to monitor weather reports and respond to hot weather advisories. So it's important that your supervisors are also keeping note on how hot it is inside the facility, if there's any type of additional administrative or engineering controls that can be put in place, and procedures, of course, when an employee is exhibiting signs and symptoms. An employee may not realize that they're exhibiting signs and symptoms, especially because sometimes some of those signs can be incoherent behavior. So you do really want to make sure that your supervisors and managers know what to look for, especially during those times when it is hotter outside and then additionally equal as hot inside as well. So another requirement from Cal OSHA for the indoor heat illness standard is a plan. So very similar to your outdoor heat illness plan, you're going to want to have a plan in place that states that, of course, employees have access to clean, drinkable water, how much water they have access to, that they have access to cool down areas, what they should expect from a cool down area. You're also going to want to have the signs and symptoms of heat illness. Basically, everything that you've trained employees on, you'll want to have that in a plan as well. So that way, employees can look back to that plan after the training. Say if they're actually indoors in the work environment and it's been a couple months after the training and they want to look back to see whether they're observing a sign of or symptom of heat illness, they can take a quick look at that plan. You'll also want to make sure that it has all the required temperatures, such as that it applies to indoor workplaces of 82 degrees. So you really want to have everything listed out in your plan, and that is something that Cal OSHA will ask for if there's ever an inspection or say you one of your employees suffers an indoor heat illness event. So you want to make sure that you establish, implement, and maintain it. It must be in English and a language that's understood by a majority of employees. So if you have Spanish-speaking employees, Korean-speaking employees, you're going to want to have that plan properly translated because it's ineffective, and that's what Cal OSHA will also give you a violation for if they find that most of your workforce is unable to read your indoor heat illness plan. It also can be included with your injury and illness prevention program. However, I typically suggest that it's a standalone document and it's separate as well from any kind of outdoor heat illness, just because when Cal OSHA requests all of your plans, such as if they request your indoor heat illness plan, you want to just give them what they're requesting rather than sending them all of your documentation. So that's why I strongly encourage my clients to have separate plans rather than just a huge binder that fits every kind of plan and information in that single document, such as an injury and illness prevention plan. And that pretty much wraps it up. I'll see if there's any questions. All right, so 82 degrees is what triggers the requirement. 87 degrees is what triggers kind of a higher standard. So there are some additional requirements on top of just your standard after the temperatures inside hit 87 degrees or the 82 degrees or higher with that clothing that restricts any type of kind of like heat prevention. And yes, the copy of the slides can be given. Let me go ahead and go to the next slide. So that way. Copy of the slides can be requested from the info@calworksafetyhr.com email address. So you can just send an email that way, and then we can send you the slides and a recording of the presentation as well.
What was the email again? I'm sorry.
Oh, yes, it's located right on the bottom there. It's info@calworksafetyhr.com.
Thank you.
And then I can put it in the chat as well if that's helpful. And then opinion on fight or flight theory of what to do. So typically with the active shooter training, and it's something that's discussed a little bit in there, is depending on the type of person and the situation. Of course, no one knows exactly how they're going to act in an active shooter situation unless you've actually lived through one. So you can either do a freeze, fight, or flight. The best way to respond is to the flight theory where you run away. However, some people, it triggers more of a fight theory. And in that case, the active shooter training will show you strategies and tips on how to have the greatest success and outcome should you choose to fight. So some of the props that are included in that are there's kind of like this mock rifle and a mock gun to show you where you can actually grab those items to try and take down an active shooter. And then with flight theory, the training will go over if you are inclined to that type of behavior when you're presented with an active shooter event. It'll show you different areas that are best to hide and to conceal to avoid an active shooter either finding you or what can best protect you from any kind of shooting. It looks like that's it. If there are any other additional questions, please feel free to send an email out to info@calworksafetyhr.com. I know the indoor heat illness standard, it's a lot of information, and Cal OSHA, as far as I've checked, hasn't put out an FAQ yet. So there are some questions still lingering. If you have any questions, please feel free to either send me an email, send your CalWorks Safety and HR consultant an email, or an email to info@calworksafetyhr.com. Cindy, is there anything else you'd like to add? Are we good? Mhm.
Do we have any questions?
I went over questions.
Okay,
Yep.
we're good.
All right. Thank you all. Bye.